people are filling their heads with esoteric and occult science. For they try, through the ego, to reach the heights of understanding that are in fact even more subtle veils, serving to spiritualize them in order to prepare them for the formation of the higher mental body. The esoteric sciences represent the antechamber of universal consciousness. I really mean antechamber. If man's consciousness is to be universalized, the forces of the universal must tear the veils of the spiritualized ego, in order to liberate the ego from above, unlike the effect of the esoteric and occult sciences that bind the ego to the lower mind, by using the high spiritual forms that cap it by giving it the illusion of high spiritual peaks. However, as much as spirituality hides the ray of light in man, so much this ray needs spirituality to descend into the lower mind and make it burst. Outside, man fears the breakup of the lower mind because all his psychological and spiritual security is contained within it. Man does not realize that consciousness is boundless. That is, it can untie all the forms that serve to contain it and create others to make it flow or descend from the top of the head to the lowest center, in order to manifest on all levels an aspect of itself, without the interference of the ego. As much as the ego is necessary in the process of spiritualization, so much so must the consciousness reverse the process when man takes upon himself the weight of this consciousness and the power that accompanies it. The spiritual man is a being in transition to consciousness and not a conscious being. For consciousness to settle in him, he must relive his spiritual life in the opposite direction, that is, he must live according to his universal intelligence and not according to the forms that served him during the involution. The unconscious man cannot collaborate with the conscious ego in the material organization of conscious life, because life no longer has for one the profound meaning it has for the other. While the life of the conscious man opens up to possibilities that he envisages according to an attitude determined by the depth of his supramental intelligence, the unconscious man cannot psychologically bear such a burden, because he drags his feet more and more in the past of his experience. The esoteric sciences nourish the spiritual ego of man, but they also serve to open certain centers in man that put him in contact with the astral planes or the spirit world. Just as esoteric sciences spiritualize man, so they can put him in danger. For man does not have a sufficiently developed discernment to be able to avoid the subtle influences that penetrate his mind, through his spiritual ego. The spiritual ego is powerless in the spiritual form, until the day it destroys it by itself. That is, by the suffering related to the penetration of the supramental consciousness. The penetration of universal intelligence into man produces a shock in the spiritual ego that undoes in him the spiritual forms as the shock takes hold and changes the vibrations of the lower mental body and the astral body. The spiritual emotion of the astral body is eventually destroyed and replaced by a spiritual void that leaves the lower mind free to absorb new thoughts detached this time from the human past. That is, free from the emotional value attached to humanity's past experience. Such an experience makes man aware of the new consciousness and forces his inferior mind to let go, to no longer think of the old thoughts that served in the past as involutionary, and to live only with the new material provided by the ego, by the adjuster of thought liberating the ego from all connection with the past and instituting on the material level a new phase of instruction free of all emotions. The esoteric sciences belong to the spiritual phase of humanity, an essential phase for maintaining in the consciousness of man any spiritual bond, but this spiritual bond at the end of involution must be overcome. For man must receive all knowledge directly from the plane of the soul without going through the spiritual astral plane. This point is of extreme importance because it is here that the science of mysteries is born. Men who think with the past of human knowledge, will be prisoners of form and will not be able to rise in the supramental void. Those who live off the intelligence of the supramental in them, will see their energies transformed by this intelligence and will be freed from the domination of form, which will lead them to openness to the science of mysteries and a pure understanding of the major keys of evolution. The link between supramental and form is impossible, because the supramental is not under the control of the ego or its emotionality. And all forms linked to an emotion can only veil the universal consciousness of man. The esoteric sciences are the very expression of man's spiritual emotion, and all forms of esoteric education lead man to the limit of his spiritual experience. Beyond this limit begins the infinity of supramental thinking. The greatest illusion attached to esoteric science lies in the spiritual curiosity of the ego, in its thirst to know the invisible worlds, in order to interpret them by its intelligence and to consider them according to this or that interpretation, since all words are prisons for the spirit. Only the unconscious ego believes itself and believes what it believes, when in fact reality is the kingdom of the spirit and not of the ego. Outside the mind of man is the upper part of his mental body and not his lower mental body. It is through the spirit that man knows and not through the spiritual ego. Although the latter serves as a spiritual reference point for him to feel the subtle waves of reality through the image and spiritual feeling. The latter is also part of the illusion of the ego. The ego must lose its curiosity and thirst for knowledge, and only the supramental consciousness can quench this thirst, awakening in it the discernment that frees the ego from subjective and suffocating thought. A thought that monopolizes its energies and encloses it in itself spiritually. Esoteric science is not the science of the soul, but the impression of the soul on the spiritual ego. A conscious ego no longer has any interest in esoteric science because it no longer fulfills it, since it no longer has the desire to be fulfilled. The life of the higher mind is self-sufficient and requires no inferior support to itself. The man who lives it no longer seeks. But man is thirsty because his thirst comes from his loneliness, and his loneliness is born from the absence of the conscious link between the soul and the ego. If the ego was conscious of the soul and could communicate with it, what would it need? Otherwise, total union rather than the spiritual feeling of a future union. It is the solitude of the ego that generates curiosity, and curiosity it feeds, so that the esoteric and occult sciences constitute for him the perfect remedy to this solitude. As long as the ego esoterically seeks to understand the mysteries of life and creation, the soul will provide it with the emotional and mental material essential to this search. But the soul will one day have to penetrate by force of circumstance and make the impressions it has created explode in it, because it will want to blend in with it instead of continuing to merge in it. The esoteric sciences are part of the evolution and spiritual education of man and all informative education, just as man discovers in his material life a gap between his intellectual education and everyday practical life in industry, just as esoteric education corresponds to an impression of reality that must remain hidden from the inferior principles of man. Although man can spiritually taste the impression, he cannot live perfectly from reality, because the impression is outside reality, since it is part of man and not of the soul in man. No need for man to seek beyond what is pleasing to him, for all that is pleasing is part of his experience and not of the light of the soul in him. Outside man must one day live off the energy of the soul, so that his lower principles can channel the energy and build on the lower planes of perfection equal in spirit to the perfection of light, but proportional in energy to the will of man. The esoteric sciences have served man, and tomorrow these same sciences will be reseeded into man's memory, for the latter will no longer live from the life of his spiritualized senses, but from the light of the soul actualizing on the lower planes forms whose perfect science will be in man's gratification. It is not esotericism in its most elevating forms, but the science of energy that will enable man to discover the power of reality and the greatness of this reality, beyond the purely spiritual impression of his image. If the esoteric sciences offer man the opportunity to envisage a future whose spiritual impression is sufficient to attach them to their teachings, it is because man has not yet understood that reality is generated in the snapshot of the powerful spirit and the energy of the soul, the light he needs to create, that is, to bring the infinity of the material closer. What man does not know about the future of his future evolution is the result of his inferior mental incapacity, that is, the fact that his inferior mind serves as a point of reference against reality in order to benefit from the impression of reality that his soul gives him through his spiritual imagination. Man is no longer at the stage of spiritual education, according to which his lower mind is the measure of reality, but at the stage of the evolution and formation of a higher mind which he forces him to no longer see through the eyes of his spiritual consciousness, but through the eyes of the universal consciousness which holds the key to his understanding beyond the spiritual desires of his ego. Although man's esoteric education provides him with psychological continuity and a spiritual foundation, the day will come when man will have to put aside the illusion of his spiritual ambitions to discover the free reality of the spirit. That is to say, pure consciousness where all forms of knowledge cannot be attached or stuck to the lower mind of the ego, since this mind will be transformed and elevated to the height of the spirit. Unless man's spirit awakens and grows in him, his subjective intelligence must disappear, as well as all that accompanies it, memory, desires, curiosity, in other words even esoteric science. What happens to man when he stops using these ancient tools? Well, he uses these new tools after training. Consciousness is infinite and the light that accompanies it is endless. And if man realizes that everything changes according to the vibration of light, it is obvious that what he has learned in the esoteric past must also change in order to give way to new and more perfect forms that constitute the support points of evolution. Man will see the day when the old sciences that served for his evolution will be replaced by new sciences, and these new sciences will challenge his material, intellectual and spiritual imagination. The level of evolution that man knows today esoterically is only an impression located in his lower mind, in order to allow him to connect mentally, psychologically to a reality that exceeds his understanding, because he has not yet lost the faculty of thought. But when man has lost the ability to think and his memory is no more than a black hole, it will be very obvious to this man that all training, all education, is no longer necessary, and that the connection between his mind and reality can only be made by the penetration of light into him. And that when penetration takes place, all relations with humanity's past are broken and all links with the past are broken, because the past only exists for man when he can think. Man will discover that there is a parallel between the loss of subjective memory and the uselessness of ancient sciences. Since man will enter a time when all knowledge will be instantaneous, where all vision will be total, where all understanding will be perfect, it is obvious that all notions, that all past esoteric sciences will have no interest on man and for him no attraction. It is not a question here of diminishing the value of the esoteric sciences, as has been said before. These sciences have helped humanity, have helped in its evolution. But the man of today who must become the man of tomorrow must begin to understand that humanity is entering a turning point, and that all habits, all attitudes must be transformed, because the man of tomorrow is a transformed man. Esoteric science protects man from his powerlessness, it protects him from his total ignorance. That is why it has done such a great service to humanity. As long as man was a prisoner of matter, it was enough for him to be educated in the light of spiritual forms, and any isolation in matter became bearable. But when man has the power to see with eyes other than those of the material body, he will then see that the combination of the light of the soul and undifferentiated energy is sufficient to release all the intelligence that an evolving being can absorb. This is why the degree of evolution is measured only at the limit of spiritual senses and not within that limit. Where esoteric sciences have served man, there they will serve him. For the day will come when man's growing consciousness will produce in him the need to live only from the intelligence derived from the principle in him, rather than from the spiritual intelligence of that same principle. It is then that man will be able to recognize in all sciences, the silver thread of illusion, because his infinite mind will no longer be bound to the form of the word, but bathed in the spirit of the letter. Out of the spirit of the letter is to the soul what the word is to the ego. Even the spiritual ego. That is why, although the sciences are completing their spiritual dominations of man, man will tremble when he sees the columns of the sacred temple fall, because his ego, his security, must be shaken in their foundations, before real science, the science of the spirit, comes down to earth. As long as esoteric science serves man, he will not be able to perceive the energy of light, for this energy is not from the domain of man but from the domain of light and man. No man can both seek and find, because the two aspects of experience require a different movement of the mind in him. The man who seeks, bathes in love for what he seeks. And he who enters reality can no longer look with the eyes of human intelligence, nor feel with the heart what is in front of him. All manifestation from the old man must cease, for the latter is no longer in the same spirit, but in the spirit of the spirit. That is, in the vibration of the energy of light in him. In esoteric sciences are part of the mind of man. Spirit tortured by the loneliness of the soul that finally wants to put an end to the search for the ego, so that the latter finalizes its evolution and in turn channels the fire of the spirit on earth. For it is from this fire that the men of tomorrow will live. As much as the esoteric sciences reflect the past of the wisdom of humanity, so much so will the science of tomorrow reflect the power of man, for this power, far from being in the service of present humanity, will be at the service of those who have understood that every attitude in them must be overcome, so that peace of mind may take root, from which its power must flow through man. Whilst the esoteric sciences ignite a deep and sustained interest in the mystery of life, this same mystery cannot be lived by the means currently available to those who seek to understand it. Man is a half-built being. It is enough that he recognizes the reality of his state so that he begins to perfect the end of the road he has left before discovering himself. It is not easy to live beyond what is beautiful and great. The esoteric sciences, by virtue of their spiritual and philosophical authority, constitute a great spiritual security for man. But the latter must one day realize that his only security is the conscious life and the creative intelligence of the universal principle in him. As long as man binds himself to esoteric science, he will diminish the power of intelligence in him. For the intelligence of the soul cannot coexist with the spiritual emotionality of the ego, because it offers him a natural resistance. Since pure intelligence is beyond the form of good and evil, it is obvious that its contact with the ego produces a vibratory shock in him, because the spiritual emotion of the ego is part of the form in him. This is why the ego that uses esotericism to increase its sensitivity and develop its philosophy of life, must at some point, face the void of reality, the void that disturbs the overflow of its intellect and forces it to put aside what is no longer necessary. The ego then disengages with anxiety, because he doubts, and the doubt pushes him further towards the void, because the time has come for him to advance naked towards the light that fills the void of his reality. No matter how beautiful the esoteric or occult language may be, the fact remains that the ego has all the keys to it, and that these keys buried inside himself must be taken out one by one from the deep ground, so that they shine in the sun of its own intelligence, fed by the principle of it. As long as the ego is hidden in the ground of the least of philosophies, he can only be a philosopher, because he does not know what he feels. And the ego must know what he feels and not only feel what he perceives. Pure intelligence must be the measure of his life, so that all forms of knowledge no longer be an essential nourishment of a spirituality that is coming to an end, before the infinite wall of intelligence and mysteries. The one who lives, becomes historical for the one who hears and listens to his story. And the story lived is to the measure of the one who lives it. If the story is not complete, because life is not, it is obvious that those who listen will only hear the fragments of reality. And since reality is beyond the ego, the latter will be limited in the long term by their own ignorance and spiritual emotions. The elevation of human intelligence caused by the connection of the ego with the source undoes everything that has been built by the ego, so that the esoteric sciences, despite their powerful and necessary spiritual vocations, will be diffused. isolating the intellect from the ego and forcing the ego to consider only the universal influx into him. This new condition of life, although difficult at first, will lighten the relationship between the ego and the soul, so that, with time, the ego will no longer learn anything, for he will know that everything depends on the vibratory connection between him and the creative intelligence. It is from this moment that the ego will understand the illusion of form, of any form, and will seek to live, rather than to feed itself. It will then be obvious to him that life itself is food, and that everything he needs to know will be known to him in time and place. The esoteric sciences, their symbologies, their values, will then become dust, because man will live by himself at all levels. Having finally conquered his reality, he will no longer be able to focus on the pleasure and spiritual security that esoteric science provided him. And so he will be able to integrate himself more and more into the vibration of the energy of the universal principles in him. The only aspects of reality to which his being is fundamentally linked. Conscious, that is, tamed in his ego, man will only live by what he knows, because his knowledge will be power. Obviously everything changes when man comes back to the light. Everything changes, because everything is outside this light. If, on the other hand, the past has served him, he must recognize that the future is infinite, and the wisdom of the ego, which in the past was the measure of his greatness, is no longer sufficient for the future integration of man. For the man of tomorrow will no longer live as the man of today, since he will no longer be the same man. That is why the ancient attachment he has known today and for centuries, for esoteric science will gradually diminish. For a doubt will lie in his mind regarding the absolute truth of this science, and it is doubt that will cause the foundations of the esoteric temple to collapse. Not because the science was not great, but because it will no longer be necessary. May it be replaced by the spiritual void, which, the absence of the desire to become more, to project what we desire most. That is to say, knowledge, which is in fact only the prerogative of the ego. The flower has no knowledge and yet it grows, so man must live detached from his spiritual ambitions if he wants the spirit of intelligence to sharpen in him and integrate him into the mysteries of creation. Man can no longer live with hope, because hope is the hallmark of incapacity and the absence of life power in itself. Man must live in the measure of the perfection of intelligence, so that all hope disappears, because intelligence and hope do not go hand in hand. Ignorance and hope are united, for hope comes from ignorance and ignorance comes from the limits of man, the limits of forms of all kinds that draw from his mind the energy that he could use to penetrate the infinite layers of intelligence and the perfect understanding of the evolving worlds. That man feeds on esotericism is a good omen, because such an activity is indicative of his growing selfish interest in the things of the spirit. But it is another thing if he imprisons himself in these forms. The energy of intelligence is the only perfection that can create and nourish the higher mind of man. Outside of this intelligent energy, he is bound to himself whatever his good and great intentions may be.